You ready? Teuana.
How can I be ready, man? How do you be ready?
Kanoan. Persian. Let's go.
So the topic of today, I will be presenting about the evaluations of research-based programs, and I'll be focusing on the empirical values for designing studies probing mediation. And the main points I'll be talking about actually are four important points that I'll be speaking about. One, that I try to introduce and speak more about the background of the study, which will include the issues that is behind this research. And again, I will explore more about the data that has been used in the study, and then I will try to explain what the results of the study achieved. And I will try to put it into the context with other existing studies, and then I will speak more about the conclusion. I will try to be as quick as possible because time runs out. So why mediation is really important? So many studies has been shown that mediation plays more important in creating theories, refining theories. This comes about when so many theories that are being used in education has been originated mainly from sociologies, psychologies, and we've been importing all those theories, trying to implement them, applying them in the context of education. But mediation plays that role where it helps us create the new theories and refine the existing theories in the field. It also helps us understand the complex relationships that exist in the variables. So it is the only way to understand the complexities of the relationship that exists. In that way, helping us understanding the complexity in the relationships between variables, I've mentioned one of them, that is actually the nested data or the structural data, or in other words, the hierarchical data, which are not simple to manipulate using the traditional means, and that is regression. So in that form, we use high-level data to understand this complexity. Like in our studies, we try to understand what is happening, what is the impact of the program on the students' outcome, but because of these are the nested data, and therefore we need to understand what students' level factors contribute to understanding these outcomes. And you should remember that students are nested within classrooms, nested within schools, and therefore the variations in the outcome are on the other side being explained on the factors that are either on the school level or on the classroom level. And that's why we use this kind of structure to understand what the school is contributing, what the classroom level is contributing in this outcome explanation. In that way, we hypothesize that teacher mediations plays an important role in understanding students' outcome. And to do that, we will also try to ask, as we mentioned in the topic, why are those design parameters, depending on the literature that you're reading, some of the literature refer to as empirical values, others call it empirical design parameters in that way, so it will depend on the literature that you're reading. But why are they important? Is it because they are needed in applying for the grant in the evaluation programs that speaks more about the impact? Is it that reason? maybe it would be that reason. But again, if it is that reason, and then we need to understand the power as it is required in those kinds of impact evaluations. And therefore, if we want to understand and calculate the power, then power depends on so many factors, so many elements. One of them are effect size, the interclass correlation that speaks more, how the group, all the people who belong to the same group relate to each other, the similarities between the groups, the sample size, the accepted type error, and finally the unexplained variance. In that unexplained variance, I want to stress more about unexplained variance. What does unexplained variance in this context tells us? For example, let's say that we are trying to understand the student's outcome, and that is the maybe student's score in this literacy program, and we are trying to understand what is really happening in this context. And let's say that we are trying to understand what we don't know. In that case, it's uncertainties that we are trying to understand. So we should establish the ways to understand these uncertainties. One way to understand, let's say that these uncertainties has 100% uncertainties that we don't know about. But we should also have a bit of information that will help us understand what's going on here. And these uncertainties sometimes are counted from 0 to 1. And therefore, that is to say, the uncertainties that we are trying to understand, it's 1. And in that context, let's say the variation, the outcome is 1. And that is 100% of what we are trying to understand. And in this context, let's say that the treatment outcomes or the treatment group contributes some level of understanding in the way that there are unexplained variance in that intersection that is explained by maybe 3% of these uncertainties. We would wonder there are still 70% of uncertainties that we still need to understand more. How are we going to understand all these remaining uncertainties? Sometimes all these remaining uncertainties are referred to as standard errors or bias. So there are a very big number of uncertainties that we still don't understand. So how are we going to understand all these uncertainties? In the way to understand it is actually to reduce errors, bias. In that way, one way is to adjust for errors. Some studies suggest that if we add on variables, that would be the best way to understand the remaining errors. That is the other way to understand the portion of unexplained variations. Some others say, let's add covariates. Covariates has been used as variables that will help us understand the remaining variations in the outcome. So that's in the way that we'll be adding covariates to understand the remaining unexplained variance in the outcome. So what's the issue there? What we are trying to research on is the scarcity of the studies probing mediation. Mediation has been neglected in these studies. There are very few studies probing, investigating what the teacher mediation contributes to students' outcome. In that case, we are trying to design studies that will help us calculate the important parameters that will be used in the literacy intervention studies. So what are we trying to do then? We are trying to address the scarcity of the empirical values that we don't have currently in literacy intervention, and therefore we will also try to provide guidelines to those who will be designing into starvation studies in the future, and therefore we'll be providing all those parameters. We used different methodologies in this research, and we used also 2 different data sets. I will speak more about why did we decide to use 2 different data sets. That's the reason that I will try to explain at the end. I will not explain it right now. I will show you why we decided to use 2 different data sets. One would be enough to explain what we wanted to achieve, but why 2? That's the point that I will explain. So the first data set we used was actually about instructional improvement that sampled 10,000 students nested within 1,834 teachers nested within 115 schools. And the second data set focused on schools' teachers' effectiveness across subjects that sampled almost 1,256 students nested within 102 teachers across 48 schools. The design that we used, this design is actually a high-level mediation design in nature that used and considered covariates to understand the remaining 70-something uncertainties that we mentioned. So we tried to use pretest the student scores and student social economic status, but we did not necessarily focus only on students' social economic status, but also the school's situation. And in that case, mainly we have been interested in researching at the impact of literacy program on students' outcome, and that is the main effect of the study. So the mediators that we have here will be considering the teacher outcomes, which included different variables according to different data set that we used. For example, the second data set that we used that focused on teacher effectiveness, we focused on some few variables like content knowledge for teaching, anger, anxiety, efficacy, enjoyment, and expectancy. These are the variables that we used as mediators to understand the students' outcome. The analysis, we used different analytical methodologies. I will not go into deep due to time constraints, but I will try to explain 3 main approaches that we use to analyze our data, one of which is unconditioned model, which we run this model by ignoring the covariates and try to understand what's going on without considering all those covariates. The second model, we consider the conditional model, whereby we put all the covariates and try to compare all those 2 models, the one that considered the covariates, another one that ignored the covariates, and see what's going on. The third model that combined all those 2 models, trying to understand what's going on happening. In that case, we are trying to explain the other unexplained variance. What does school level contribute to understand students' outcome? What are the factors on classroom level? What are the students' own characteristics to understand all those variations? So we are trying to combine them and compare. So what did we come out with? The studies show that there are different variations and variability to different levels. For example, here our study found that the school itself has been able to explain at least 4 to 37% of variability, and that is the first data set results, which showed that schools level factors contribute a lot to understanding what's happening on the mediation, on the student's outcome. On the second data set, the study found that the school has been able to explain another portion of variation which would range from 70 to 50 or 50 to 70, which is also a big number of variations that school use will contribute to the understanding what's going on. In that case, we would, if we don't consider the different levels that contribute to students' outcomes and consider one level, maybe we would make a wrong inference, saying that maybe there is no school's contribution to students' outcomes, all the students' success depends on their own factors. But on the other side, there is the contribution that are attributed to school level, which is explained by the variability of the school and how school differ explain the portion of students' outcome. In general, to summarize the findings, the study indicated that the variability observed across classrooms and schools, considering the first data set that explored the instructional improvement, the research shows that variance attributable to schools range from 4 to 37. That means this is the school contribution to understanding the outcome. On the second data set, schools contribute up to 51 to 71% of what's going on in the outcome. Coming back to the point that I mentioned earlier, why did we choose to use two different data sets? I think you've got an idea. The first data set showed the teachers' variability, teachers' variance contributed from 4 to 37. The second data set showed that the school differences accounted for 51 to 70. You should understand this difference. Why are they different? Using two different data sets, getting two different results. Why? That is to say, each and every data set we used collected data in one context, which cannot be generalized into the other context. That is, in other ways, to say that these value parameters are context specific, that cannot be really generalized into different contexts. Each context will have its own design, which cannot be replicated in another design, and that is the point to pay much attention to. To conclude our findings, that we tried to understand the new literacy program, what it contributes to understanding students' outcome, and that main effect has been mediated by mediators, as we showed, to different mediators. The study iterated that design parameters are critical for studies that investigates what drives the difference in teacher development. That is to say, understanding students' outcome, we don't necessarily need to go further into students' own factors, but we really need to consider what's going on this teacher side, what's going on the school side, so that we would comprehensively understand what's going on. The findings using two different data sets also highlighted the need to consider the context. Context really matters most. As shown in two different data sets, two different results, that is to say they are context specific. In other words, we try to contribute on design parameters that were not there before. To those who are interested in designing literacy intervention studies in the future, would tend to use these design parameters that we calculated. We'll be helping more. I would also not forget to emphasize that those who are interested in conducting future studies would choose to put more mediations, to put more covariates, because these are the studies that are not there in the literature. Try to combine mediators and covariates and understand what's going on, what's happening, because our study is not enough to explain what's really going on, but really we need more studies that explaining what's really happening in this literacy intervention. Thank you.
Good job. Good job. That's great, man. That's really good. Yeah. You nailed it, man.
Too much panic. How is it? Eh?
Really good. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Really good. Maybe some comments. Right at the beginning, did you explain a little bit about what the design parameters is? What are design parameter values? Pretty sure the audience is not familiar with these terminologies, design parameter value. You put it there, but
I didn't explain, right?
it might be a good idea to just what are they? Parameter values, design parameters, empirical values. I think you can just say design parameter values, because it's a little bit more confusing having multiple names. Or you want to explain that some different papers use different names for this?
Yes.
Yeah.
There are some
Empirical values. I don't think that's you seen that one somewhere, like empirical values. Normally it says empirical design parameter values or empirical design parameters. So I think the third one you can remove it or you can add empirical to empirical design parameters. But yeah, just explaining, brief explanation what is design parameters, and then okay, so this paper is doing this. So I got that.